It's the TMZ Behind the Bar podcast with the TMZ lawyers, Jason Beckerman and Derek Kaufman.
Welcome to the Behind the Bar podcast, where each week we bring our perspective to the biggest stories in celebrity news. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
Remember, everyone, it helps a ton if you download, listen, and review the podcast. Only good reviews, please.
Yeah, 5 stars and above. I think 5 stars is the cap, but only 5 stars.
Just kidding. We'd love to have your reviews, good and bad. We learn from them a lot, and also, suggest what you'd like to hear from us in the future. We're always looking for good show ideas.
We're hungry for ideas. Tweet us, Instagram, anything.
And every episode can be watched on TMZ's YouTube channel, so check it out there as well. Fascinating to watch Derek and I do the exact same thing that you can hear for 30 minutes.
But you get to see all of this, Jay.
right. As I'm
Real treat
I'm
for
privileged
everyone.
to do. Derek, I mentioned at the top that we like to discuss the biggest stories in celebrity news, and this week that can only mean one thing, which is Brad and Angelina.
There's nothing bigger. So Brad and Angie divorcing. Angelina filed divorce.
Let's talk about the size of the story for a second. These only come around once in a while. Typically, unfortunately, they're death stories. Prince's death, Michael Jackson's death being the two sort of ones that come immediately to mind. But in the outside of the death context, I'd say Ray Rice hitting his fiancée, Donald Sterling and the audio tapes, and Brad and Angelina's divorce really rank up in the sort of Mount Rushmore of biggest stories.
I think that's right. They're in the pantheon of famous couples. You've got Will and Jada, maybe as big, Beyonce and Jay-Z, and then it's Brad and Angelina, and they're kind of 1A and 1B.
Yeah.
No one's bigger than the other. This is an enormous
I think
deal.
you're giving too much credit, frankly, to Jada Pinkett Smith just because she's Jada.
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. Yeah.
And not to take anything away. She's a star, but not a mega star like the rest.
You're right. These are two supernovas. They're as big as you can get in the world of celebrity.
Yeah, we digress. Brad and Angelina.
So Angelina filed for divorce. This was a sudden event, right? So no one knew there was any trouble on the horizon. Angelina files for divorce, and we see the petition, and she's looking for primary custody of the kids. They got 6 kids, 3 of them adopted, 3 biological children. So big deal. She's looking for primary physical custody. Then we start to hear that there are allegations of physical abuse of one of the children during an incident on an airplane. Brad was allegedly pretty inebriated and got physical with one of the children and maybe balled up a fist and pushed him. We're not sure exactly what
Initially,
type of
we
physical
heard
abuse.
balled up the fist and punched him, but
That's
then this
right.
sort of might have been watered down. But we're just not sure where that lies.
Right, but we know that it happened.
And he doesn't even deny that there was some sort of physical contact.
He acknowledges that there was an incident on an airplane. They were on a private jet leaving somewhere or returning to the U.S., and there was a physical incident with one of the children.
Right.
So that's where we are, and she has said, I, as a result of this, am going to need primary physical custody of the children, which is a big deal. Usually, this seemed like a very stable couple.
Yeah.
You would expect joint custody.
Yeah, and just I don't think there are whispers of other physical contact between Brad and the kids.
That's right.
Kid or kids at some point, right?
That's right. Maybe a history of anger management issues or increasingly being drunk and physically violent with the kids. But the only incident that is concrete at this moment is the one on the plane where he acknowledges that something happened.
Right. Now, Brad obviously denies any abuse at all. He acknowledges some sort of physical contact, but not abuse. And it's important to recognize that there is some daylight between that. It is clearly okay at times to punish your child through corporal punishment, through spanking, through, there are different kinds of things. I don't want to speculate exactly where the line is. We'll get into that.
Yeah, this used to be much more common back in the day. It's less frequent now, but still corporal punishment is pretty common.
So we're going to get into exactly what constitutes abuse versus corporal punishment. But before we get there, let's briefly talk about why Angie's allegations of abuse are so critical to the custody of the children. The vast majority of divorces with children present do not involve contested custody litigation. You touched on this, right? Most of the time, parents are able to amicably resolve child custody issues, either because both parents equally want the children, they split them evenly, or because one parent wants nothing to do with the kid, right. And unfortunately, one parent is either wants to or is saddled with sole and exclusive custody of the kid.
Yeah, most divorces come in. It's irreconcilable differences. You say, we don't get along as a couple anymore, but typically you'll see joint custody arrangements because both want to do what's best for the kid and they both love the kids.
Right, and I've learned a lot about this recently. It's not an area of law you or I have ever practiced before, but I think there's some really interesting factoids in here. Under not only California law, which would apply to Brad and Angie's situation, they were married here, they've lived here, they've raised their families
Even
here.
though they're globetrotters.
They're
California people.
But when there's a dispute, like with Brad and Angie's, the standards, we're all very familiar with it, right? It's the best interest of the child is the prevailing standard when judge is trying to determine which parent is going to get primary physical custody of the child. In every state, however, including California, there's a presumption that joint custody with a healthy co-parenting relationship is in the child's best interest. And in fact, California law is ahead of the curve on most of these things. I think, California is sort of famous for pushing kind of the parental rights and things like that. And California law specifically requires that custody orders ensure that kids have, and I'm going to quote this for a second, I'll get by it, frequent and continuing contact with both parents, and that both parents share in the rights and responsibilities of raising a child. The exception to that rule is when such an order is not consistent, once again, with the best interest of the child. And there are some very obvious factors. What is the child's preference once a child is of age? And here that might be an issue because Maddox, who is rumored to be the child who may have suffered the blow from Brad.
And he's 15.
And he's 15 years old, will have a lot of input on where he would prefer to stay. And they will ask him what his preference is. And you may get a lot of, whether this becomes public or not, may get a lot of insight in what actually the relationship is with his father based on what his choice is.
Yeah, there's actually a statutory presumption for 14-year-olds, right? That you get a say. Maddox could stand up in court and say, "I prefer living with Angie,
That's
and
right.
Brad's no good for me. He's no good father." He could say all that to the judge. Now, how much the judge weighs it is in question. Whether he's going to listen to it, he's ultimately going to make the decision based on what's in the best interest of the children.
Right.
But he will factor it in.
But it's an important point. Once a kid reaches 14, the judge is going to give great weight to what that child's preference is. If the child is 10 or 11, the judge can certainly consider it, but it's not going to have the same weight because the California legislature and the legislatures of many other states, I saw New York, Rhode Island, and a few others, have passed similar laws. And another factor, one parent's unwillingness to co-parent. It's called the King Solomon effect. If you want it all for yourself, meaning I refuse to have this other parent have anything to do with my kid, judge is going to look and say, well, actually, if you sought it all, you're going to get nothing because it's obviously the other parent is better. Educational needs, healthcare needs, and then most significant for our purposes is if there's a history of domestic abuse, typically within the last 5 years, either of a partner or of a child, the burden then will shift to the party seeking, the abusing party, to show why they should nevertheless get joint custody, even though they've committed these abuses. And last thing I'll say, and it just can't be he said, she said, there must be independent physical evidence. So if she says there's abuse and Brad says there was no abuse, the judge cannot take that into consideration in determining parenting.
So what kind of official record within the last 5 years would be sufficient? Like, does there have to be a police report? Does there have to be a therapist that was reported to? What would take it out of the realm of he said, she said?
Yeah, it would have to be somebody who was not just echoing the sentiments of one of the two parents. And so if the kid spoke to a psychiatrist, and there's rumors of that happening here, that psychiatrist filed a report and it found that it was plausible. Certainly, it's only a presumption, so Brad could rebut that presumption through evidence.
Right.
But nevertheless, that would be the presumption would then be that he would have to prove that nevertheless, notwithstanding these allegations of abuse, he should still be entitled to parent the child in a 50-50 way.
Right. So let me get this straight because I think we gave a lot to digest.
Yeah.
So the presumption in general is for joint custody for both parents to play a role.
Yep.
But that presumption, the default, let's call it, shifts when
Right.
there's domestic abuse. And it shifts against the person who's accused
Against the abuser. That's right.
Against the abuser. So now the abuser fights the uphill battle against losing custody.
That's right.
So to speak.
Right. And just to sum it up, courts will always try to keep both parents in kids' lives, always in the best interest of the kids to have two parents. That's the presumption of the law of all 50 states, is that you want both kids in their lives, and only when there's some sort of evidence of something that should take that apart does it happen.
Now, I want to pause on two issues. So Maddox is the oldest kid. Maddox is 15. We've got Pax, who's 12. Zahara is 11. Shiloh is 10. And the twins, Vivian and Knox, are 8. Who gets a voice? Only Maddox? In this case, because
it seems that way.
North of
14 and older. Now, again, it's not just he is the one that has a voice that the judge must consider by law in making his or her eventual decision.
Got it.
The other kids can certainly be asked, and if the judge feels that they are of of an age and of an intelligence level and a maturity to have input into their final decision, the judge can consider that. But kids are it is very famous, and parents try to do it all the time. They're easily manipulated. They're easily brainwashed, and therefore they can be coerced by one parent or a therapist to say something that isn't necessarily true. That presumption goes away once a kid is 14 or 15. Anybody who's out there, parents understand that. Once your kids reach a certain age, they think for themselves. They're not going to do just what mommy asked them. But a 7 or an 8-year-old is certainly going to be easily manipulated by one of the two parents.
Right. So it's a really sort of family court is a pretty flexible place, though. Let's say Maddox or Pax stands up. He's 12 years old. Maybe he's a very mature 12, and the judge thinks, I want to hear what Pax has to say. He's only 12. He's not 14. But I don't think he's going to just say, say, do Angie's bidding.
So, Derek, the next step in this, of course, is, this was the case if there was allegations of physical abuse. But again, spanking a kid or traditional means of corporal punishment are not abuse. So, and it's hard to know exactly where those lines lie, where those lines are drawn. So why don't you walk us through, if you can, what is abuse and what is just parenting?
Yeah, you're right. Look, this is really this is a difficult issue, okay? And there are no real clean lines, but the Attorney General of California stepped in 1997 and issued an opinion to try to give some clarity. And sometimes Attorney Generals do this to say, here's how you should behave. Here's what's abuse. Here's what's not abuse.
We want to guide the courts. We want to guide people who are out there wondering what abuse is.
Right. So the question in that case was is it okay for a parent to spank a child with an object other than the hand? So this was actually looking at whether you can spank a child with a paddle or with a cord or a wooden spoon or something like that. But it gave you sort of the general parameters of what is abuse. So there's a penal code that's involved, right? Because we're dealing with
criminal laws,
a crime, right?
Yeah.
So Section 273 says anyone who, quote, willfully inflicts on a child any cruel or inhuman corporal punishment, meaning punishment of the body, or any injury resulting in a traumatic condition. That's what constitutes abuse. But
so
even you look at that, it's hard to define.
But it's interesting. There's a subjective standard there, right? Anything that is inhuman or might be cruel, that's going to depend on what people in the community think is inhuman or cruel. And let's take the Adrian Peterson child beating case down in Oklahoma, which happened a couple of years ago. Adrian Peterson, one of the great running backs in the NFL of all time, admitted that he took a switch, a small branch off of a tree. Was it in Texas or Oklahoma?
I think it was Texas.
It was in Texas. Took it off of the tree and whipped his child with it to the point that he broke open the kid's leg in a number of places, caused severe welts and bleeding. The mother reported it. He ended up being suspended by the NFL for a full year, but he was not criminally prosecuted for those acts. If that happened in Santa Monica, California, where I live, which is super blue liberal,
and there were pictures and everything, it was pretty graphic.
It was pretty graphic. He would be imprisoned for that conduct, but no charges were even filed in Texas against Adrian Peterson.
Right, because in the South, hitting the kid with a switch, they call it grabbing a branch off a tree, it's hitting him with a switch, is a pretty common practice. Probably more common back in the day, but still something that goes on and within the bounds of decency to that community.
That's right. So you talked about a subjective standard, what is cruel, what is inhumane, and there's a very objective standard under the law, which is, did it cause traumatic injury? And I mean, I guess there's some subjectivity there, but that's to a doctor's subjectivity, not necessarily just to the public at large.
That's exactly right. So we try to define these terms. What is a traumatic condition? Now, the other word to focus on here is willfully inflict. So you remember with Brad, maybe he was inebriated. Maybe the willfulness is going to be something that they're going to tease apart. But it's a real rabbit hole. Willful is, did you intend to strike the kid? And even if you're drunk, you're usually not going to get around willfulness, right? Okay. So traumatic condition, the California criminal law includes any kind of wound or bodily injury. Could be any kind. And really what this gives is
great latitude.
Great latitude. It really does. They want to look at each circumstance and not be hamstrung. But it doesn't depend on what some people think of as the intent to leave a mark. If you leave a welt, you've gone too far. That's really not the standard, Jason. There's a spanking that could leave some redness, and that would be within the bounds of acceptable corporal punishment.
Right.
So you can't just look to, is there a welt, is there a scratch? That's really not the standard that's applied. Now, not a good look. If you have pictures.
No, especially for Brad and Angelina, who are fighting it as much in the courts of law as they are in the courts of public opinion, right? If he caused a mark, if he gave a black eye to a kid, his career is going to suffer bigly. To quote to quote Donald Trump,
bigly.
Yeah,
an acceptable word, by the way, bigly.
Yeah, totally acceptable. You pointed that out to me.
Now, disciplinary spanking, though, I want to point out is okay as long as it's reasonable and necessary under the circumstances. So this is really what child psychologists look to as: are you doing it in a disciplinary way rather than in a fit of rage? Right? Do you do it consistently every time a rule is broken? Do you give a spanking in the same way so that the child learns?
Or did you just get so angry because of something that was going on maybe in your life that you decided to take it out on your kid? That's going to be looked at with a jaundiced eye, I would assume.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So really those are the standards, and that's what Brad is going to be up against. Now, I do want to point out we've done some other stories because Brad has not only – now, he's admitted some incident happened, but he says it was within the acceptable parameters of parenting discipline. Now, he has raised an interesting issue. Now, Angie flies the kids around. She's kind of a UN goodwill ambassador, and he said – she actually subjects them to some danger. Now, this is obviously very different than child abuse, but what do you think of that? How do you think that will factor in, that she brings them to war-torn areas where she's subjecting the children to some type of danger?
What a bunch of nonsense that is.
You don't like that, huh?
I don't at all. I mean, everybody's just trying to do their best to parent a kid. Everybody is. I think these two people really do mean well. trying to do their best to parent a kid. She's trying to expose their kids to real life out there. And if you're going to be judged for that, I mean, these are co-parenting decisions that you need to make together. And if you can't, those are reasons for separation. But parents have a right to raise their kid. Each parent has a right to raise their children as they think is in their best interest. Now, that there's obviously laws that can be broken if you go too far by punching them or whatever it is, but nevertheless, the idea that bringing them to a wartime country to have them see the reality of what life is like is somehow punishable by or sanctionable by laws is to me ridiculous.
Especially if Brad is bringing this up only now, and he was going on all of the trips and said, "Let's go see the Syrian refugees" and so forth. It's going to be a tough argument to make at this point.
Right. So this has been sort of a serious discussion, maybe the most serious one we've had in one of these podcasts.
It's a bit of a downer,
but it's a downer. But it's important. But let's bring it up a little bit. Let's find a little levity here. And let's find levity not in child abuse, obviously, but in divorces.
Yeah, I mean, let's do the lighter side of divorce.
People.
Yeah. So these are two very, very wealthy people. There's a prenup.
Yep.
So, shocker, everyone. When Brad and Angie got together, they were already enormous stars. Brad came off his relationship with Jennifer Aniston. She had previously been with Billy Bob Thornton. They were huge global superstars already. So, of course, they cut a deal.
Yeah.
There's a prenup here.
There's
of
a
course.
prenup.
But it's not the typical prenup.
It's not the typical prenup. Oh, do you want to talk more about the prenup? I want to talk about times when prenups come and they get tossed aside and people have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars anyways.
I just want to say it's probably not the typical prenup in the first instance because these are two very powerful parties who were probably very well represented and made a deal that made sense for both of them. Usually you have one party with very little power and one very powerful party trying to get a prenup to protect their assets.
Great segue, because that's one of the reasons that some of these great prenups and the most famous celebrities in the world have been tossed aside because one party, let's take Steven Spielberg, for example. You may have heard of him.
Yeah, billionaire Steven Spielberg.
Billionaire Steven Spielberg signs a prenup with Amy Irving back in the late 1980s, I believe.
Yeah, he had some E.T. money, but maybe pre-Schindler's List money.
Pre-Schindler's List money for sure, and hadn't become like
Jaws
one of the wealthiest people. Hadn't become the near billionaire Steven Spielberg that he is today, but had a few $100 million. And he decides one night that he wants to marry Amy Irving, but you can't just rush into these things. You got to write a prenup. So what does he do? He picks up a pen and he jots it down on the back of a napkin.
I love that.
This is in 1984, actually. I now have the year. They married each other. They signed the prenup. 4 years later, they decided to divorce because he wanted to actually marry somebody else, Kate Capshaw, who apparently was really hot at the time.
Hey, good on him.
Yeah,
I mean, listen, the heart wants what it wants.
So Amy Irving's not going to take this sitting down.
She brings out the wet cocktail napkin?
He brings out the wet cocktail napkin and says, "Hey, Judge, we have a prenup here. She doesn't get anything." And Amy Irving says, "Look, I was poor. I had no representation. Steven Spielberg had lawyers to rely upon. He had done these. He was very familiar with contracts. He duped me into this prenup. I want it tossed out." And the judge, in fact, did throw it out and gave Amy Irving $100 million, which was exactly 50% of his net worth at the time.
Because California community property, he was nobody when they met, probably.
Nobody.
And then he made a ton of money on Jaws and E.T.
Yep.
And she got her half. I mean, that's really the way the law should work when you don't have a prenup. I mean, this is not a huge windfall for Amy Irving. If she got with him while they were both struggling people and he blew up, he blew up while the community existed.
But he left her for Kate Capshaw in the way that he did, thinking, hey, I don't have to pay her a penny.
Right.
If I do, maybe I'll tread a little more lightly.
The cocktail napkin did not work.
So $100 million is a lot of money. We have Robert and Sheila Johnson. Robert was the founder of BET. He left his wife, Sheila Johnson, ended up paying, notwithstanding a prenup, ended up paying $400 million to her in a divorce settlement. We don't know exactly why the judge threw it out, but he did. Michael Jordan paid Juanita $168 million, notwithstanding the prenup. Probably there were some allegations that he had been unfaithful. Sure. There was some desire to cover things up. And you see this a lot. We see this a lot, that if the husband wants to buy, typically it's the husband with the money, and in the top 10 biggest divorce cases, they're all the husbands with the money. If they want to keep sort of conduct that happened during the marriage covered up, they will buy that with additional money in addition to the prenup. My favorite one, my favorite, but it's topical.
I know, your favorite huge divorce?
Donald and Ivana Trump.
Yeah, very topical.
Lockdown prenup, notwithstanding it, she challenged the legality of it in 1991, walked away with $34 million.
Probably as a result of a settlement, though. They didn't actually fight it out. Exactly. She ended up tapping out, or he tapped out and paid her some money. What's interesting, though, is we hear this a lot in our room, Jason, and I just want your thoughts on it. We hear that she took him for all his money. This always grates, I think, on you as
both
well.
Of us, yes.
this is not money-hungry women grabbing at their husband's fortune.
Right.
Really, in a true marriage, it's a community, and
It
there is
is.
some sacrifice on either side. Maybe they raise children, maybe they keep the home, but this is not someone taking someone's money. Every dollar you make in your marriage, 50 cents of that is your wife.
That's right. Now, there
or
may be a
husband's.
contract, a prenup that gets in the way, but absent that, it is wrong to say because she worked and he didn't, and she earned the money and he stayed home and took care of the kids. It's therefore her money, and how much is she going to have to give of her money to settle this divorce?
Right.
That's the wrong way to look at it. It is their money. Every single penny is their money, and the question is, how do you divide it up when it comes time to divorce?
You got to think more in terms of we. You
That's-
just do.
you-
And Jason has told me this, and I know it sounds contrary to the way people think about it, but that's really the way lawyers look at it. Now, the biggest one, Jason, I'll tell you, the divorce in 2009 after 23 years of marriage to Slavica, Bernie Ecclestone,
Yes.
over $1 billion. They say between $1 and $1.2 billion. Bernie Ecclestone, obviously of Formula One fame, owns a bunch of teams.
That's right.
His daughter Petra, very famous.
Now,
it's a lot of money.
Now, there was no prenup in those cases.
Right.
In that case, right? They had to split 100% of what they had together. They had earned it together during the marriage. She walks away with 50% of that. That's the way it goes, Bernie.
It's a nice party.
He didn't like that, though.
No, but not a gift, but a nice parting sum.
So
let's
Derek
call
and I
it.
always want to remind you guys that when people fight like this, the real winners are the lawyers. So just always keep that in mind. The
Yes.
lawyers are the real winners, and for that, we can be thankful.
Yeah, the longer things go, that billable hour. Wow, it's like sweet, sweet music to us.
Did you hear that sound?
What is it?
Mail time.
Bring it, Parker.
All right. First up is a Colin Kaepernick question. Great podcast. If there was a policy in the players' collective agreement or an NFL bylaw or a clause in his contract referring to political protest, a moral type clause restricting this type of statement/behavior, what would take precedent between the three?
The contract would. Collective bargaining agreements, especially when they are negotiated on behalf of extremely wealthy organizations, in this case the NFL on the one hand and the NFL Players Association on the other hand, are going to take precedent. You can waive your constitutional rights to speak. You can waive your constitutional rights to act in any way, to speak out against the league. This is why you see in the case of Donald Sterling, for example, although a little different, there was no collective bargaining agreement, but nevertheless he had an agreement with the National Basketball Association. And a lot of people ask, how can the NBA just deprive him of a $2 billion franchise?
Property rights.
Simply because he spoke his mind in a private conversation with his girlfriend at the time. And the answer is, because that's what the contract said.
Answer is he agreed to it.
Yeah, that's right.
He signed on to that contract. A contract is two parties coming together and agreeing to something. And when Donald said, I give you the power to take away my team
Yes.
if I do something like this, he gave it up.
So, Derek, could the NFL stop? You think, based on the existing CBA, collective bargaining agreement, could the NFL stop Colin Kaepernick from sitting through the national anthem?
You know, I think it's actually pretty interesting. Now, that would be waiving a fundamental right of free speech, but I think you could waive it.
I think
you
they
could
could
waive
too.
it. Now, not all rights are waivable.
No,
there
but,
are rights
but,
that you
but
can't
they,
give up
They
even
have
under a contract.
they have these best interest. Right, you can't subject yourself to molestation or
Right.
or
You can't agree to be murdered and things like that.
Right. But getting back to it, there are these clauses in every one of these contracts. You guys have all heard them. These what is in the best interest of the league clauses, and basically that gives the leagues carte blanche to do whatever they want. And if they thought that Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was not in the best interest of the league, they could stop him from doing it. And I'm sure they could. But can you imagine the outcry? You wouldn't be able to field teams
That's
the
right.
following week because these NFL players, most of whom support Colin Kaepernick, even though not that many have come out publicly and said it yet, would be up in arms about that.
Very well said. Very well said. Parker, whose question was that? That was one of the most sophisticated questions we've had in a while. I like that. Shout out.
This one was from Rhiannon.
Shout out to Rhiannon. I think that's Rhiannon.
Oh,
Rhiannon.
Great
from,
song.
from Fleetwood Mac. Wow, it could have
Oh.
been. I like to think Rihanna follows the podcast.
Yeah. We'll just say it's shout out to Rihanna.
Yeah.
All right, next one up is from Nora Phillips. Y'all talked 2 episodes ago about Brock Turner carrying the stigma of being a convicted rapist. But what if he changed his name? Would he still have all the consequences since he'd be on the sex offender registry, but with a different name?
The internet is vast, has long tentacles.
That's exactly right. Every time that he applies for a job, now let's say he changes his name, there's going to be background searches on who he is. You could see the name change potentially in court documents. It'll be difficult to do that anonymously, and his face will pop up in association with that story for the rest of his life. I don't think a name change quite does it.
I think it probably helps him, so he at least doesn't have
Helpful.
to introduce himself at parties.
Right,
as
you don't
Brock
have to
Turner.
say Brock Turner here.
But the first time he goes in, you have to change your name. You have to file a document in court. It has to be open court. It's not private. The judge will get it. The clerks will see it. The other personnel in the courtroom will see it. They will leak that out. It will get out very quickly that he has sought to change his name. He would have about 2 days of anonymity before.
And remember,
before
every job does a routine background check, and he was convicted of an offense.
Yes.
That's going to come up on every background check, and you can't just change your name to
he was
get around
convicted
that.
of a violent felony. Tough stuff.
This is going to chase him around.
Wouldn't they just change his name on the sex offender registry?
Good question. I assume they would, actually.
I think you have to. I don't think you can change your name to get off the sex offender registry. I think that's a good point.
If the law that established the sex offender registry didn't contemplate that we'll have to change this in the event somebody changes the name, it would render the sex offender registry a nullity, right? Because everybody on it would simply go and change their name, and they'd no longer be on the registry.
Yeah, you can't go in and be like, I'm Larry Fogel. That Jared guy sounds like a bad dude, but Larry here.
The last one up is from Michael Rocha. I love the show. My wife and I are big fans. We both got our BAs in criminal justice and admire you guys. It's just a happy note to end on.
I don't think Parker knows what a question is, but
Yeah,
I love the
I don't
comment.
know.
Thank you so much.
Comments or questions?
Oh, right.
I love it.
Behind the
Send
bars.
in all your compliments. You should just do 3 compliments next time.
Okay.
All right, thanks very much for tuning in, everybody. We will be back again next week. Next Thursday, you'll see a podcast pop up, and check us out on YouTube.
Maybe something lighter than child abuse?
Nah.
Nah.
Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episodes over here.